Welcome to Coffee and Contemplation. I'm Heidi.
I'm Robin.
And today we'll be talking about Chapter 2, The Weirdo on Maple Street.
Back for episode 2.
Heck yeah!
So first things first, as is our custom, production shout-outs to start with. So this one was written and directed by the Duffer Brothers, as well as Jesse Nixon Lopez. In the first episode, I didn't shout out the costume design, so I just want to mention the costume designer for episode 2 anyway was Kimberly Adams Galligan, and then the editor for this episode was Kevin D. Ross, who coincidentally edited 2 episodes of The X-Files, both during the revival. As a note relating to the production design, something that we did not discuss in the first episode is that having only been born in 86, I'm not as familiar with the culture around having posters on your wall. So for example, the Evil Dead poster in Jonathan's bedroom, and the Dark Crystal poster in Mike's bedroom, the Jaws poster that you actually don't see until this episode, I believe, in Will's room. The reason that those things wouldn't have been on the walls isn't for lack of interest, but it's because those posters apparently just weren't being produced at that time. Even in the 90s, posters were starting to become more available. So,
oh god, yeah.
But in the 80s, that no one was mass producing those yet. It wasn't. I mean, it was probably around that time that people were starting to really want those things, but it just wasn't as common. So I don't care personally.
I don't know whether it's just from memory or maybe I've just kind of got time in a slipstream and remember more from the 90s. But I really feel like I've even seen historical images of teenagers with all kind of shit on their walls.
I think it's more the kind of stuff that you would see in their lockers and things. It would have been magazine cutouts.
Yeah.
Things like that. And so that's why I think people like you and me are gonna not think twice about it. Because we were more, we remember that more from the 90s, but also the spirit of it is there.
Right.
And I think they probably went ahead and did it anyway because, again, the series is so fastidious and detail-oriented that I think they probably were aware of the fact that this was going on, but they said, we're going to do it because the spirit of it actually helps very quickly tell you who the characters are, what their personalities are like. These are the kind of, the fact that Mike has the Dark Crystal, it does a lot for characterization, so
yeah, there's also foreshadowing. Because, the first thing that I thought, I was oh, Will's got a Jaws poster in his room? Now, Jaws had a noticeable impact on my childhood in that, sharks were the things that I had nightmares about when I was a kid. I was my Joyce, are you gonna get scared moment would have been I don't really think I want Will watching Jaws. But yeah, in conclusion, the posters are fine.
So moving into episode discussion, we're going to do the same thing that we did for episode 1. So we're going to do them by thread or blocks of characters. And there's a little bit of overlap here and there. So we've got the kids themselves. We have Hopper. We have the Byers, Joyce, Jonathan, and Lonnie. We have the high schoolers, which is Nancy, Barb, Steve, Tommy H, Carol, and kinda Jonathan, sort of. The lab. And then we'll conclude with any other miscellaneous observations. So yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah.
So we open pretty much where the last one left off, more or less, and the show gets a lot of appreciation for that in season 1, where the episodes tend to pick up where the previous one left off, more or less. There's not a lot of time jumping involved, and I think that's one of the reasons it's so bingeable.
The season doesn't feel episodic. The season feels like one continuous story, which we're used to now in prestige television, but also it just very much feels like turning a page. It doesn't feel like starting a new volume. Yes, that makes it super bingeable, but it also really makes the whole thing very, very cohesive and very literary in some ways.
My instinct is to say that not only are there no time jumps, but it also stays wherever the point of view was last, whatever group you were with last, it doesn't change. It ended, not only do we pick up basically not that long after the last chapter 1 ended, but chapter 2 opens with the same group that chapter 1 concluded with. So we ended with the kids and 11. This one picks up with the kids and 11. And that's something that, I noticed the editing more in this episode. The way that it's used for pacing. It's hard. It's funny. I feel like we're doing a really good job of not just gushing constantly about how awesome, so much of this show is, but, I just have to say it. I love these characters, how sweet they are, and how they really feel like real kids, but also they feel like kids in an adventure story.
Yeah. And the acting, all of the kids are really, really good actors. But just because they have more screen time and more intimate story building and relationship building moments in this episode, I was just absolutely knocked off my feet by Millie Bobby Brown and Finn Wolfhard's acting in this episode. The thing that I said last episode about Elle being very much like an animal, and I mean that I'm a huge animal lover, so I mean that in a very positive way, that kind of continued in this episode. And I found myself sort of reading her through that lens of being obviously very human in her complexities and emotions, but in her reactions and in her, the only way that she is able to cope with her environment or process her environment, I think is probably a better way to put it, is reacting on this very animal level. And so the huge eyes as she's looking at Mike and Dustin and Lucas and just begging them to understand her, and the sort of wonder at being treated gently, and the laugh with the lazy boy, but also the incredible fear that she shows and that she reacts to both Dustin and Lucas with, and the moment when she gets angry, uses her powers against Lucas and says no. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I could just sort of watch their scenes over and over and over. And the way that Mike shows Elle so much compassion, so much empathy, it's really, really great. I mean, I don't think it's controversial to say that the emotional core of the show lies in the relationship between Mike and Elle. And you can see that developing just right away. And the chemistry between the two of them, and I don't even mean necessarily in a romantic way. Yes, of course, it becomes that.
It develops into that, yeah.
Just their emotional chemistry is so strong.
I like that you see her hiding a lot of what her emotional state is from the other three kids for so much of this episode. And then in that scene with just Mike, the pacing of that, the tone of that scene, how it builds slowly, you can totally feel all the pieces of the storytelling working together so well, because the cinematography, you get this very, very incremental push in on both of their shots, so that eventually you're in these very close-ups, these very tight close-ups, but it doesn't start that way. I had never noticed that transition happens slowly. Where does that intensity suddenly come from? And it's it doesn't come suddenly from anywhere. It's building the whole time.
Right.
And so when he says, "You're in trouble, aren't you?" She has this micro expression, and it's you suddenly see it. And then all of that's cut by, "I gotta go," So it's just really brilliant.
Yeah, and with the micro expressions, because she has so few words, you're forced to just very intently watch her face and wait for that one word. You have a great deal of literal communication, even without those words.
The synergy of all these pieces working together. And yeah, one of those pieces I really do think is direction.
Of course.
I want to give Caleb McLaughlin some extra shout out here, though, because I feel like that both the character and the actor both get very, very vastly overshadowed by the other three. Even four, if you include Noah Schnapp in that, because I feel like Lucas doesn't get as much love in this first season because he is the character that throughout these early scenes and even in episodes to come, he's the pragmatic one. He's the one who calls everyone out. He's the one who's this is dangerous. He doesn't care about Elle because he's so focused on Will.
Right.
That's almost more challenging in some cases. And I love the complexity of the scene in the bedroom because I totally get where Lucas is coming from.
Yeah.
I would probably be thinking, if not saying, all of these things if I was in this situation.
Yeah.
If you know where Will is, then tell us.
Yeah.
But you also completely understand why she can't. You understand why Mike is being empathetic, so especially because Mike is also there going but she knows, and she's scared. So Mike is the one sitting there going, it's complicated. We can't.
Right. I never ever disliked Lucas. The times when Mike and Lucas were fighting, it just made me sad because I very intensely like both of them and because I could always see both sides. This time watching through, especially knowing that we were going to be talking analytically about it and so on, I was very much yeah, I totally get where Lucas is coming from. So I second the shout out.
I love that he is so steadfast in his determination to find Will. I find that so admirable. And he also, like, there's a moment in the classroom when he and Dustin are talking that he has this, like, absolute conviction in Mike, which I thought was kind of great.
I don't think that the show would be so good if it weren't for the complexity of the writing of the kids. The kids are treated like people. They're treated like young people, but they are treated as complex human beings. And if you had the characters being just cute, then I don't think that the show would be as successful, because it wouldn't feel so real. And one of the ways that we see that is actually in the relationship between Mike and his mom. Karen is trying so hard to reach out to Mike and to be there for Mike. And we see, of course, that, Mike's not in a place where he feels comfortable confiding in his mom for a variety of reasons. But we also see, in the very beginning of the episode, that Mike's like, we'll have Elle go outside, she'll knock on the door, my mom will know exactly what to do. So we see that, there is a lot of love there, and there is a lot of trust there, but this is a situation where he doesn't feel safe going to his mom, literally because he's trying to protect her and himself and Elle and his friends. We see kind of in Mike's face that he feels bad about it. I don't think that Karen is portrayed as emotionally available or as close to her children as Joyce is. And, we had Joyce in the first episode saying, well, he's sensitive. She also, really, really understands and values the complexity, both of both her children.
I also like, too, that, to your point about, Mike, feeling bad a little bit by not talking to his mom. I agree. I don't know if I necessarily think he would have opened up at that point, but it's an interesting question to think about. But also, at that point he has promised 11, he said, and he explained what a promise means. So it's he's like, I cannot. Yeah. Which also explains his reasoning for being to Lucas, no, I can't. Just one other detail I wanted to mention about the dynamics between the kids is they talk like real kids based on the writing of it, the way the dialogue is formed. Although I will admit some of the dialogue is a lot clunkier than I remembered. Yeah. But it doesn't sound that way because they deliver it so well. The tightness of the exchanges, the fact that the kids are talking back and forth so fast, when you have a lot of lag or space between dialogue like that, in scenes when it should feel more rapid fire or it should feel just faster, that often makes something feel amateurish. But a lot of times that's one thing an editor will do, is tighten those pauses between lines or elongate them so that you feel more dramatic tension. And so I really appreciated that, both in the scene with Mike and Elle, alone in the basement before he leaves for school, but then also in the scene in his bedroom. No, we're telling your mom. And then, and then you get those long silences. We talked about in the first episode how, you've got all that back and forth between Joyce and Jonathan. And then after the phone call, it's silence. The show uses silence really, really well. Yes. A large portion of that is contributed to from the editing. When Mike is showing 11 around the house, a little detail I never thought about, but really jumped out at me this time, is the fact that not only does he give her clothes, the sweater and the sweatpants, she's wearing socks. Yeah. And she's barefoot when she's in the lab. I don't think we ever see her with any kind of footwear when she's in the lab. But the fact that she gets to wear, I don't know, I found that just so sweet.
Yeah, I noticed the socks too. So yeah, that's maybe a visual cue for comfort and coziness and warmth.
For later seasons, I like that the foundation of, or rather, maybe not even but just I want to note that the foundation of their relationship is him kind of being caretaking for her. Yeah. And showing her his house and this introducing things to her, and not in a way that feels condescending or problematic. It just feels very organic and very sweet.
Yeah, very, very much so. I would say that, reading the show through a feminist lens, I do think that there are some gender problems in the show, a couple of which we'll talk about in this episode. But one thing that I have to really, really give a lot of credit where it's due, and one of the things that I just absolutely love about this show every time I come back to it, is how nurturing and empathetic so many of the men are in this show. And in their own way. Hopper is very, very empathetic right from the go. Jonathan and Mike both are not only empathetic, but like specifically very nurturing. And especially with Mike. Mike is a character who is founded in empathy. And I absolutely love that about him. And it's framed in a way that is sympathetic toward him. The text does not treat Mike as if he is different for being the way he is with Elle. It's totally normal. He does not get punished for being empathetic, because a lot of male characters who do show empathy get punished for that by some sort of terrible disaster befalls them because they dare to have emotions.
Yeah, the narrative like punishes them for it.
And that doesn't happen to Mike. Mike's successes as a character and his triumphs as a character come from his empathy. And that is really, really valuable. There are plenty of male characters who have empathy for one person. I mean, you could almost argue that, like, that's kind of Hopper's journey, letting people in one by one. That's not Mike. Mike is empathetic toward Dustin. He is empathetic toward Will and toward Lucas and toward Elle. He is just a profoundly empathetic character in this season. It's something that I enjoyed, of course, the first time around, but each successive time I watch the show, I appreciate that more.
I agree. So speaking of the other male characters, let's go ahead and shift into Hopper's arc. Last episode we saw him be more, I'm a badass, like more cavalier or seemingly cavalier, but this one we really see him getting very, very like going inward.
Yeah.
Starting with that early scene where he comes to deliver the news to Joyce and Jonathan.
Yeah. The situation is putting him in a pressure cooker. Like with him walking outside and like not being able to face Jonathan and like, you know, taking the pill on the sly and like all of that. That speaks to someone who has gone very, very much inward and is not able to take any more stimulus. You know, I feel for him. He is shutting himself off from his emotions because he's finding them difficult to deal with. And then, you know, one of the big moments where you can just see, like, not only has the button been pushed, like, you know, Joyce took out a sledgehammer, is like, don't you think you'd recognize your daughter's breathing? Because of course he would. I mean, Joyce realizes that she's, I wouldn't argue gone too far, but, you know, you can see that she realizes how much she's hurt him.
I think that scene is more awkward than anything else.
Yeah.
I actually really like that she doesn't apologize for saying that. I don't get from Harper's performance that it's like he's angry with her. He's just like, oh yeah, that hit.
Yeah. No, I think he's just in pain. I don't think he's angry at all. But it's a very normal, rational human reaction to just be like, I don't like feeling that thing. Cool. I'm going to shove it under the rug, you know.
To that now this ongoing discussion about empathy and the valuing of non-traditional masculine traits, I actually think that the way that he reacts to Jonathan is actually very encouraging of who Jonathan is as a person. Like, I think him saying, like, it's important that you are here for your mother. Like, I actually see him very, like, validating of what Jonathan is doing. Like, I think he runs out to be like, I can help, and I'm scared for my brother will trust me. But Hopper is like, you are contributing, is kind of the way I read that.
I wish that was my reading of that exchange. My reading is a little bit different. I think that's what Hopper wants to do because he's put himself under so much pressure and everything. I think that he's like, kid, leave me alone. Go take care of your mother because I can't take care of your mother because she's stressing me the fuck out. I will go and find the kid. You leave me alone. Don't want to deal with you. Probably it's a little bit of both.
I was just thinking that.
You know?
I was like, I can see there might be room for a little bit of both.
But, I mean, Jonathan certainly takes it. He does it in one ear and out the other. But I do see moments of empathy of Hopper in, like, conversations with the other cops. Even in the quiet conversation of the foreshadowing, Hopper being like, you cannot jump off of this, like, 5-story ledge into water and survive.
Yeah, just where they are, like the blocking of them being up on the rock, and I can see how this episode I would say struggles from a number of I saw some production things in this one in multiple arcs that we'll get to one at a time. This is the first one where there's this thing that has to happen, so we're gonna just do it. But yeah, it's like there's no reason for them both to be up on that rock. It kind of bothered me a little because it was kind of like, yeah, that's purely there for foreshadowing.
I have a confession to make, which is very, very silly. That entire scene gets a stamp of, yeah, okay, cool from me, purely because of Hopper's sunglasses. I am like see, I told you it was silly. I told you that it was silly. Because I am like a huge fan of traditional aviator sunglasses. I have a pair, like Ray-Bans forever. And I was just like, no, I was like, yeah, he's got the good aviators. Because I'm like fussy about, the shape and everything. So, yeah.
And it is a moment of levity in a way.
This is also a moment where we're reminded that Hopper is an intelligent, competent person. Because he's like, no, you can't jump from this height. When the other cop is like, oh, so-and-so did it for $10 on a dare. He's like, no, he's a liar.
And yeah, it's interesting. Like, Callahan and Powell, they are idiots a lot of the time, but Callahan way more than Powell, I think. But I actually think that they both, in this episode in particular, not in that scene on the rock, but when they're in the woods, like, Callahan's questions about whether or not this kid that they saw that was seen at Benny's restaurant, why would he be starving? Like, why would he have his head shaved? Like, those actually aren't moronic questions.
No, they're good questions.
And especially considering that we know it's not Will. To me, it indicates that he's picking up on that. And I think Hopper is like, when he says, well, when we find him, we'll ask him. When Powell says, you can't ask a corpse a question, I don't see that as a vicious line either. Like, I don't think that he's saying it to be mean or condescending.
I think it's a thoughtless comment. I mean, I would never say about a missing child, well, he's a corpse. But I agree with you. I don't think that from Powell the character's perspective that he is being in any way intentionally unkind. He just, especially in the case of a child, if you don't find that kid within 48 hours, it's not going to be good news.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels like a very, like, just kind of blunt and honest statement.
Yeah.
Like, we may not have that option, sir.
Yeah.
Like, Hop. I agree. And actually, I think that might be an interesting way to sum up both of those characters. They're not stupid. They're just a little thoughtless sometimes.
Yeah.
Overall, I do really enjoy the vibe between Hopper and Callahan and Powell. Like, as much as they are annoying or thoughtless as the case may be, I do buy into them as a unit.
Sure.
That they do have a working history. And that also, it could also be, this just popped into my head, they're maybe not used to Hopper being that combative, invested.
I think they're used to coffee and contemplation, joking around. The Hopper who gives the illusion of being chill, in control, not overpowered by his emotions. They're used to the Hopper who is okay. This Hopper's not okay. And they're not quite sure how to deal with that.
And then kind of my only other kind of observation, I guess, about this episode regarding Hopper was I actually really like the woman, Sandra, that he's with. She's on screen for only like a couple of minutes, but I actually really think that Bethany Ann Lind, the actress who plays that part, does a really good job with, like, this nothing role.
Yeah.
No one else seems to talk about her, but I think she and Harbor actually had some pretty good chemistry.
Oh, fuck yeah.
And I find that, knowing that she never appears again, I'm kind of disappointed about that, because I actually really like her. Like, I know she's barely in this episode, but I don't know, like, I liked the dynamic between the two of them.
Very much. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, like, that scene makes me sad.
Yeah.
Because I think it's a mutually failed attempt to reach out. He is very much not in the headspace that these are two separate cases. He knows they're connected. And he's trying to tell her how much it's bothering him and how much it's coming up. And he's trying to, like, tell her, like, what if it's my fault? And it's a very vulnerable thing to admit, and he's really trying to, make that connection with her. She is trying very much to soothe him and to say, like, no, that's not what this is, and you're letting your demons take control. Come inside, be with me, let's get warm. It's not a good idea for you to stand out here by yourself in the freezing cold and try to blame yourself for things that have nothing to do with you. But they don't have the magic key to communicating with each other that Mike and Elle have.
That scene follows not long after the scene between Jonathan and Lonnie. Those two things being so close together is interesting. I mean, as awful as Lonnie is, I actually kind of like that the show doesn't, like, only mention him by name or we see him and then he's gone, so he feels like this throwaway character. Like, you know, if he wasn't going to go anywhere, then, or if he wasn't going to have any, like, you know, active involvement in the story, then I would say, like, yeah, just let's not see him at all. But I like that he is relevant to the narrative. So we already talked a little bit about the scene between the Byers, between Jonathan, Joyce, and Hopper in the house.
Right.
On his way to Lonnie's, though, we go into a flashback at that point because he's in his car. He hears, that's the first time we hear, should I stay or should I go?
All of the flashback scenes with Will are just, they're so good. Mm-hmm. If the flashbacks were just hitting you over the head with an emotional frying pan, or if it was just completely saccharine, it would not be effective. Mm-hmm. But the reason that it is effective is because we get so much character building in that scene. The relationship between Jonathan and Will, even the relationship between Joyce and Lonnie, Jonathan's relationship with Lonnie, and even Jonathan's relationship with Joyce in relation to Will, and that dysfunctional parental dynamic. Because, like, that whole thing of, like, being in a room with the music on and the door closed and turning the music up so that I don't have to listen to the adults fighting, that's real shit. But I, being my mom and dad's only child, I have 3 half-brothers and they're much older than me. So it's interesting to see that kind of coping dynamic happen between 2 siblings, especially with one sibling who's a great deal older than the other sibling and is kind of, Jonathan has kind of taken on that hero child role. And that's not me criticizing Joyce. Every family is dysfunctional in its own way. Mm-hmm. So that dynamic is just really, really valuable. And, you know, like I've already kind of sung the praises of the empathy of Jonathan and him being a mentor and a guide and like wanting to share his music, and the fact that he made his brother a mixtape was so sweet and so loving, because you're taking something that you like and specifically curating it. You literally have to let the music play and hit record and hit stop for every single track. It's not about just like dragging and dropping into, you know, a playlist. It's a labor-intensive thing, and it's part of what makes it so touching to me is because it's so normal. The 2 of them sitting side by side and him being like, you don't have to say that you like this, but do you? Mm-hmm. And being like so happy to have the opportunity to share something he likes with his little brother. And then the 2 of them like sitting there nodding their heads to the song was just out. Like, oh man.
Well, and I like that scene begins in, you know, independent of the conflict that's going on with the parents.
Yes.
Like, so that you know that it's not like, oh, Jonathan, they're hanging out and then he goes, hey, Will, let's go listen to some music. Like, it's that relationship is in and of itself a really wonderful thing. Stands in really interesting contrast to Nancy and Mike, for example.
I think Lonnie, I'm not going to say Lonnie does or doesn't love his children. I mean, I don't see any evidence of him loving his children, but I'm not going to go that far. But I will say definitively, and I don't think anybody's going to argue with me, Lonnie doesn't like his kids.
No.
I get the impression from him he probably never really wanted kids. And I also don't think he knows Jonathan at all either. But he doesn't give any impression of being interested in actually getting to know them. So yeah, Lonnie is like a walking wasteland of toxic masculinity. It's just entirely obvious, like the way that he treats Joyce, the fact that he's dating this woman who's like so much younger than him, hasn't even like, you know, this woman doesn't even know about Jonathan's existence, I'm pretty sure.
On this rewatch, I got a lot of like narcissism vibes from him.
Yeah.
And you feel that even before you meet him.
Yeah. Again, this aspect of Jonathan and Will's relationship where both of them are very emotionally present for each other. And that's kind of a double-edged sword because, again, like Stranger Things does have its gender issues. One thing that a friend of mine said is like, yeah, well, they're really, really good at showing complex emotional relationships between men. Mm-hmm. There's like a safety there because it's, you know, 2 brothers, and I want to acknowledge that. But at the same time, Jonathan is encouraging Will not to capitulate to the expectations of toxic masculinity. You don't have to like baseball. You don't have to, like, this, that, and the other thing. And, like, I'm not going to sit here and say that, like, you know, Jonathan is introducing Will to something that's not traditionally masculine. I mean, the Clash is totally traditionally masculine. I love the Clash. Don't get me wrong. But I do think he's telling him, like, you don't have to be afraid to express yourself in the way that feels right to you. It's okay for me to be into photography. It's okay for you to be into going to the arcade. You don't have to be what he expects you to be or what he's trying to force you to be.
It's okay for you to be you.
Jonathan is a foil for Lonnie because Jonathan is saying, you can like whatever you like, and Lonnie is saying, or we know that Lonnie has said, he's queer because he doesn't like baseball. You know, like
true.
Those kind of like really, really, really homophobic, hurtful, abusive things. And Jonathan is coming in and saying, no, there's nothing wrong with you.
Yeah. We have Lonnie himself. I react viscerally to his line about Will was never able to take care of himself.
Yeah.
I'm like, at what, 10? Really?
Your point about narcissism, actually, the more I think about it, the more I agree. Because his whole attempt at influencing Jonathan by being like, oh, you think I don't want to see you? Maybe I'm not the asshole. I mean, it's so obviously not true. That scene has always made me super, super uncomfortable just because I have known people who will employ that kind of manipulative thinking. Because the thing that I was thinking the whole time was like, oh, that's your mother talking. You think I don't want to see you? Yeah, I think you don't want to see him. You have a car right there, and you never fucking drive over to see him, to see either of them. You're standing there with your 12-year-old son missing. You didn't even call your ex-wife when you found out that he was missing, and your reaction is, my 12-year-old son can't take care of himself, and you just don't give a shit. You don't give a shit that your son is missing. You're so busy insulting your ex-wife that you're not even asking what's going on about your kid. And you're like, oh, I just assumed that my ex-wife lost track of him. I mean, do you not care? He could be dead. The Reddit consensus is in, you're the asshole. And that's why, like, the narrative anxiety for me was, is Jonathan gonna fall for it? And so I was like, oh God, like, is he gonna believe him? Is he gonna, like, have to deal with this on top of his missing brother? And so when Jonathan is like, here, in case you forgot what he looks like, I was just like, oh, thank God.
He's such an interesting contrast to Joyce in general. Mm-hmm. Joyce is so high-strung, and he's so smooth. Kind of like, wow, okay. And maybe that's why she was sort of drawn to him, was because he was a much more calm, collected, very seemingly stable and steady person.
Well, and I think, too, like, there was probably, like, the bad boy appeal.
Maybe. The narcissism thing really stuck out to me when Cynthia comes up. He has, like, no reaction to her.
So, yeah, in conclusion, we do not like Lonnie.
Joyce is a total badass with getting the phone and getting her 2 weeks advance. And the final scene with Joyce that we get in this episode is when she runs out to the car, and then when she hears the music come back on, she goes back into the house. I actually had to go back when I was watching it through the first time to make sure, do we see what happens to her after that? And we don't. So that's a moment that I want to, bookmark and pin for later discussion. We're going to circle back to that in a really, really fascinating way that hit me this time, and it hasn't any other time.
I love that she's just, like, determined to be there, like, to be present in the house should anything happen. Joyce has a very, very realistically maternal reaction to the things that happen, even the supernatural things. Like, I mean, I know many, many, many moms who, if their child was missing and then all of a sudden there was some sort of indication that their child was trying to communicate with them through flickering lights, they would not stand there and say, well, logically. They would not question it. They would be like, it's not just a storm. It's not. She knows exactly what's happening immediately. She just goes straight on ahead. I love that about her in this episode. But I actually hate the last shot of her for a couple different reasons. Totally do not blame her for screaming her lungs out and then running out of the car. And I also, like, really admire her for plucking up the courage and going back into the house when she hears the music start again. I love all of that. But the way that the camera follows her or rather doesn't follow her, and the way that we just like watch her walk into the house. You know, I know it's a common horror trope, and that's actually why I don't like it, because I think it's really, really exploitative.
Don't go in there.
Yeah, it feels don't go in there. It feels very much like this is the last time we're gonna see her. And I like, one of my things that I hate to the point of it will ruin something for me even if I enjoy it otherwise, not even so much like people being the horror movie trope of like white people are stupid, like going into the haunted house, that I can deal with that. But like people deliberately going to their death, it really bothers me on a big level. You wouldn't have to extend the sequence or the scene that much more for it to totally, like, if like the camera, instead of just like staying put and watching her walk in, and maybe you have insight onto why that just like gets underneath my skin and just like really bothers me.
No, I think you've nailed it.
Just watching her go inside and maybe like seeing her get the axe
Later,
like,
yeah.
Yeah, because that means like I have a weapon, I'm going to confront this situation, and then we cut. Fine. I just
like you leave off with like her sitting in the car going, you know, like racing the steering wheel and going like, I should go back in. Like, you know, if you left it there, or even if like you had it that she just gets out of the car, like end it there, like something like that. It's what they're evoking. And Stranger Things, like that's one of those occasions where I think paying homage to horror, theoretically they're doing it well, it's just we're not super into that. I just think it's kind of, I mean, honestly, I find it kind of a lackluster shot, if I'm honest. It's one of the least dynamic visuals in the entire episode, probably the entire season. Like there's not a lot visually happening there because it's such a wide shot. It's just kind of a slow crane up, which ends up visually being very different to the way that her running out of the house is shot.
Yeah.
So that's always just kind of been my takeaway. But no, I think you've articulated it very well.
Okay.
Considering this is the same episode in which Barb essentially meets a not so great fate either.
Right.
You know, we get our very first half glance at the Demogorgon's lack of face. Mm-hmm. So it's very similar in that you theoretically don't know what happens to either of them.
Right.
But presumably something very bad to both of them. Mm-hmm. And to be totally honest with you, I don't remember what happens the very next time we see Joyce. Obviously she's okay.
Yeah.
But I don't remember how they follow up with that. Whereas I definitely remember how what happens to Barb. So speaking of Barb, shall we move on to the high school group?
Yes.
All right. It's important to say that going back to these early scenes, I'm surprised at how difficult it is. Steve Harrington has become one of my favorite characters. But when I first watched this first season, like people would make defenses for him and I'd be like, no, that he's awful. I hate everything about him. So I have my initial reaction still kind of in there and still very aware of how truly awful he is at the start of this show. But also like the post season 3 perspective doesn't want to look at that. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to rely on you a little bit to keep me honest in both directions.
Okay.
To not be overly critical, but also not to cut him too much slack.
Yeah, like I really, really appreciate your reading of Steve. I will be honest, this is the sequence, or this is like the character group that I was least looking forward to talking about, because in this episode, there's also some stuff that I dislike more with every rewatch, which isn't usually the case with Stranger Things, as you've heard me say. But yeah, this is, I think, one of the first indications that there is a big gender problem in Stranger Things. As good as it is, and I do enjoy it very much, don't get me wrong. And I think there are some good gender things in this episode, which is strange because there are some really good things going on here too. Mm-hmm. And I attribute that honestly to them having a woman co-writer. But yeah, I find this really daunting to talk about, both to give credit where it's due and to give a careful analysis of what's going wrong.
I mean, and to, like, I highly value the perspective that you're going to bring regarding these gender issues, because I don't think I see them as clearly. So, like, I'm really glad, though, that you are going to have the keen eye for that, because I don't think they get addressed nearly enough in the discourse about season 1 in particular, as awesome as it is. So, kind of starting, I guess, at the beginning with this group. The scene in the hall at school, we meet Tommy H. and Carol. But I noticed that once they see Jonathan putting up the missing poster, I noticed that Tommy's the one that makes the joke, heavy air quotes here, joke, how much you want to bet he killed him. Steve will echo that in a subsequent episode.
Which I totally bleached from my brain because I didn't want to remember it, but that's cool.
Yeah. the idea that he's like big man on campus and all of that. Like I know that there's a performative element going on there, but especially based on Steve's reaction to what Tommy says, just how much is he performing for them?
I think extremely. I think all of us can at the very least relate to putting up with things from friends that you don't actually like because you haven't yet acquired the skill of establishing boundaries. Mm-hmm. This happens all the time when you're a teenager. But I think Steve is already starting to realize that this is not actually who he wants to be as a person, but he is reliant on Tommy H as his best friend. So he's stuck in a dysfunctional relationship with Tommy. So I see so much of what Steve is doing as performative. And that's not an excuse. That doesn't mean that he's not being an asshole. Mm-hmm. He is being an asshole. Mm-hmm. And it's that much more frustrating because I know that there is more to Steve. Like Tommy H, I'm just like, you're a fucking waste of space. Like, it's, I don't want him to like die or anything, but like I have no interest in him. Mm-hmm. But with Steve, it's like, I know you know better, at the risk of sounding very much like an adult. But when he comes by and he swipes the flashcards off of Barb, he's totally doing that for Tommy's benefit. When he says to Nancy, my dad left town for a conference and my mom went with him, the expression on his face as he's looking at Nancy is just kind of like hopeful, like, hey, you want to come over? Like, my parents aren't home. I'm sure he is hoping that they will like make out or whatever, but it doesn't have that kind of like predatory, derogatory energy that Tommy then immediately brings into the scene because Tommy's the one, and I forgot this because I thought it was Steve, but Tommy is the one who says, she's right.
Or good call or whatever.
Yeah, like, that's a disgusting thing to say about your best friend's mother, that she's right not to trust the father.
Yeah, Steve's whole delivery of that is very, or I guess I should say Joe Keery's delivery of that is very like, because, parents.
Yeah.
Which also, that is kind of horrifying and like, that's just the default that he knows. Like, that's just how parents are.
They just leave him alone.
Yeah. That's a really good, I never thought about that. You're right. Tommy is very predatory, but Steve never is.
Yeah. So, and then when Nancy is like, you mean like a party? He's not like, yeah, you stupid bitch. It's like, yeah, a party, come over.
And everything that happens, it's like, Tommy is always one level higher than Steve. Like you mentioned, Steve takes the flashcards. Tommy's the one that like sticks his finger in Barb's ear.
Yeah.
Taking the flashcards is not that bad.
I mean, it's annoying as hell,
it's
and
annoying.
I would have been upset by it in their position.
Oh, same here. But then to see that followed by Tommy doing that, it's like gross. And then the thing about like how much you want to bet he killed him, it's like, and then Steve goes, either he doesn't fully appreciate like what Tommy just said, like he thinks it is a joke, or he's like, too far, man.
I also think he sees Nancy's reaction.
Well, because that was a question I had, was like, considering, as we said in episode 1, the kids clearly know who he is, like, does he know the kids? Like, not know them, obviously, but
sure.
Like, has he been around them? Like, does he kind of go, you're talking about
her brother's best friend.
And then she does go over to talk to Jonathan. You can feel their sparks already.
Oh, absolutely.
When she turns to leave to go to the test, that Barb waves?
Yeah.
Or no, she nods. Someone waves.
She acknowledges him.
Tommy waves, which feels very condescending, but Barb, like, nods, like, encouragingly.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, yeah. I never noticed that before. Okay, I have to say it. When Nancy is on the phone with Barb, all of Barb's lines, if you listen to it closely enough, it's all the stuff that she says in the car.
Oh.
It's all just ripped audio from that later scene. And so it feels lazy, which I would not normally call Stranger Things lazy. Does it make mistakes? Yeah, but it's not a term I'd use lightly. Because as we've discussed, the details, the production side especially, have been very thorough. So it bothers me because it's like they couldn't pull Shannon Purser aside to do wild lines for like 2 minutes.
What is a wild line?
Wild line is when you record something on set, either something that you need to get as like a voiceover or something that's in a different scene. And so it's something that they may end up recording as ADR, which is automated dialogue replacement, which is when you go into a studio and re-record your line separately. So it made me wonder, like, was that scene with Nancy added like really, really last minute? where they like, quick, grab Natalia Dyer. We're like a week out from this dropping on Netflix. We need it now. They rushed and scrambled to like get that last scene, and so they couldn't get a hold of Shannon Purser for whatever reason. And so they just ripped the lines from the other scene. But I find it so frustrating, especially because I think even in the context of that scene on the phone, you hear her say, "This is so stupid," like twice on the phone, like once at the beginning and once at the end. And they're all lines that work, but just the fact that it's the same take even, or either that or she delivered the lines the same way in multiple takes, but it kind of gets on my nerves a little bit.
So let's talk about that conversation in the car. This is one of the things that is really, really complex, because throughout the rest of Barb and Nancy's relationship, you have two narratives going on at the same time. I understand both. I can appreciate both. I'm uncomfortable with the presentation of the two of them together, because I feel like they were on the cusp of doing something really cool that hasn't been done before, and I think they almost get there. I don't know that I will ever land on how I actually feel about the dynamic between Nancy and Barb in this episode. I don't like the way that Tommy H. and Carol, and actually to a small part, even Steve. Like, again, watching this episode again, Steve's behavior toward Barb is a lot less offensive than I remember it. Because I've been watching very closely, because I know that, like, I know that you are really invested in Steve as a character. I know I'm really invested in Steve as a character. Knowing where his character is going, I'm interested in tracking his progression to get there, especially, like, almost especially in these early episodes.
It's kind of interesting, though, that you're thinking that it's not as bad as you remember, and I'm like, it's
and you're
so
thinking,
much worse!
Yeah. So I totally understand why she doesn't want to go to this party.
Oh, yeah.
But what I don't understand is why she's being a little slut-shamey. In the first episode, we saw, like, we just made out a couple times. And her being like, get it, girl! You know, like, being very, like, supportive and, like, you know, oh, you like him and he likes you. And because she sees that this relationship, interaction, whatever, is making her happy. And so she's like, yeah, you are allowed to want. You are allowed to want to get in his pants. They're both consent, you know, they're both of sound body and mind. So her being like, is that a new bra? I see a lot of judgment toward Nancy's sexual desire.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah.
So I actually read that interaction very differently. Just the interaction in the car, I feel like Barb is going, Nancy, just be real about what's happening here. Like, I don't hear her saying, like, you're not allowed to want to sleep with him. I get the impression that she's like, why am I here? Nancy, he wants to sleep with you. I'm gonna have no place in this moment. Like,
yeah.
And her going, like, is that a new bra? Like, I hear her going, like, girl, you want to go be with him. Can you just admit that, please?
Yeah.
And not drag me along? I don't see this going well.
Yeah.
For me. I can support you, but why am I here? So that's kind of what I heard in that. And so her just going like, would you please be honest with me and with yourself? Come on. You bought a new bra.
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah. But, I mean, I like that reading. I'm perfectly happy to adopt that reading, honestly. But I'm uncomfortable with the way that Nancy is treating Barb throughout the entire episode.
Yeah.
You know, like, she's treating Barb like a handbag, like some sort of accessory.
And not reading her best friend's discomfort well at all.
Come on. You'll be my guardian. Make sure I don't get drunk and do something stupid. Nancy has every intention of getting drunk and sleeping with Steve.
Well, and then kind of acts all irritated when Barb is like, Nancy, you asked me to basically chaperone you, and now you're telling me go home, which I wanted to do in the first place.
Yeah.
To jump ahead, like, when they, in that moment on the stairs, like, because I've always wondered, why does she stick around?
That, to me, like, her sticking around after that conversation was because the plot says she does.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, if I were in Barb's situation, I don't hang out. I don't hang around. I mean, especially, like, I've never had a conversation like the one between Barb and Nancy where I was like, I don't approve. Or whatever. I really don't think that I would, like, hang out in that space. Like, I'd be gone, dude.
The bit with her cutting her hand really bothered me this time.
It bothers me too, because it's kind of a culmination of everything leading up to that. And I totally hear Barb's, like, frustration and hurt, and her saying, like, I'm fine. Barb is not remotely fine. So, like, the thing that I really, really dislike, like, the two things that I dislike most in this episode that bother me a lot are the thing that we already talked about with Joyce and Barb saying to Nancy, this isn't you. I mean, granted, we don't know Barb all that well. We see her very little, but that doesn't track with what we have already seen of Barb. And I mean, I guess maybe there's some concern, like other times when I have watched the episode, I have read it as Barb showing concern that Nancy is adopting the same posturing behaviors as Steve. But I don't 100% buy that reading. I just think I think it's manufactured conflict between the two of them because Barb has to be outside so that she can be killed by the Demogorgon. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is an attempt at an inversion of the stereotype in horror films of if you have sex, you will die. Unsuccessful because instead what it becomes is you must have sex or you will die, which is no better because it still comes from this misogynistic place of having authority over women's sexuality. And that's such a bummer because I actually really, really like the dynamic of the sex scene between Nancy and Steve.
So do I.
It's so consensual.
Yeah, it is. It does, at the same time, does end up being a if you have sex, you die. Sort of. Because to me, it's that she has sex, her best friend dies, so she's punished for the rest of the season.
Yes, and indeed the rest of her life.
You know, you mentioned that those are the two things that you hate most about this episode. The thing I hate most is Jonathan taking the photos.
Mm-hmm. Cheers.
I don't buy Jonathan taking those photos at all.
It's not that I approve or am okay with Jonathan taking these pictures. It's just so gross and just so like ugh to me that I am just like, I don't even think about it. I don't even like waste analytical thought power on it or energy. I'm just like, yeah, that's gross.
It's nonsensical. It doesn't make any sense. So you're telling me Jonathan sat there in the bushes, watched them all in the pool for who knows how long, watched them all get out and giggle and flirt and do whatever while they got out, go into the house. So now Jonathan can't see anything. While Steve went and got towels for all of them, they stood in that area by the sliding door for 5-ish minutes or whatever. Tommy and Carol go up to the room. Nancy and Barb have the scene on the stairs. Nancy follows Steve upstairs, and then Barb goes outside and sits on the diving board.
And Jonathan's been there just creeping in the bushes this whole time.
Looking at nothing?
Yeah.
No, I don't buy that. I remember the first time I watched the show, I remember thinking, this isn't happening. No. Like, I felt like I already knew the character enough by that point to be like, he wouldn't do this. But I think it's another, like, horror movie-ish, with teenagers and whatnot.
Yeah. I think it's a pretty extreme example of the Duffers' tone deafness, especially, when it comes to gender issues, because I don't think that anyone who understood what it would feel like to be photographed without your knowledge or consent in a very, very intimate moment like that would have included a heroic character doing that. And I say all of that as someone who likes Jonathan, and even in later episodes and later seasons where he does things that I don't necessarily agree with, there's nothing like this.
Yeah.
So that's why I say, like, I just totally write this off because I don't think there's any actual, like, real narrative payoff.
Yeah, and to some degree, I guess, I don't either. That's why I say, like, I don't buy this. And I think that's why I'm so frustrated because, again, so much else of the writing is so, like, the plot beats in terms of the plots fitting together. It's like, I even mentioned I didn't like the thing on the rock, but ultimately that's pretty harmless.
Yeah.
Them using the audio track from another scene, like, that's relatively harmless. This harms the character, it harms the story, and it doesn't work for me, so.
Yeah.
But I have to say, I actually I agree with you, I'm really impressed with actually how they handle the sex scene between Steve and Nancy. And yeah, like when he walks back over to her, it's very sweet.
Yes.
And it feels very romantic, which feels very different from the scene in the first episode. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. And then we do get our first look at the Demogorgon. Which,
funnily enough, again, like I've watched this episode and obviously this scene more than once, I have yet to actually see the Demogorgon. I'm always so focused on looking at Barb that I have never seen the Demogorgon. I'm fully okay with that.
I noticed that watching it on my TV screen, it was harder to see. I noticed it more clearly when I was watching it on my computer.
That will be the reason, because I think every time I've watched it, it's been on a TV screen.
I mean, it is a full frame shot of its non-face.
Yeah.
Of the petals. Petals open with all the teeth. And then the episode ends.
Yeah.
I love the use of A Hazy Shade of Winter, covered here by the Bangles. I love that cover. The first time watching the episode, it felt very intentional. And I think, like, especially because there's the line, "Won't you stop and remember me?" Which feels very applicable to multiple characters. And it's just the tone that it sets feels, especially the way they use the intro, like, it's just very, very effective.
Co-signed.
Overall, wrap-up thoughts?
I think I've said my piece. How about you?
Overall, I do think that I liked episode 1 a little better.
Same here.
But I think at the same time, I also think that this episode took bigger risks. I still overall like this episode a lot, but I struggled with it more than the first one. But I remember, like, when Jonathan is walking back up through the woods, and then it cuts back to the extreme wide shot of the Harringtons' backyard and the lights come back on, I was like starting to think, no, don't be over yet. That was the thought. And so because it's like, I still marvel at how the show manages to evoke that response, but it does.
Absolutely. So that concludes our discussion of Chapter 2, The Weirdo on Maple Street.
Thanks for listening.
Over and out.
Wow, are we a narcissist? I don't know. I am not a licensed psychiatrist or psychologist.
No
one is.
Well, nobody. Shit. Nobody is. There's nobody in the world that is qualified to talk about psychology. What I meant to say was, nobody here is a licensed psychologist.